Hello, everyone. My name is Miguel Farias. I am an experimental psychologist, particularly interested in the study of spirituality, spiritual practices, and beliefs. And today I'll be talking to Dr. Russell Razzaque, who is a London-based psychiatrist. He's been working within mental health settings for over 20 years, particularly in the NHS. He's also an honorary senior lecturer at University College London, and we will be talking about his book, which has this wonderful cover. The title is Breaking Down is Waking Up, with the subtitle, Can Psychological Suffering Be a Spiritual Gateway? Hello, Russell. Thank you very much for talking to me today.
Right.
So, one thing, so you mentioned quite a lot of your work, both within a mental health setting and how you've part of your journey into meditation, how this has helped you understand in a different way your patients. And at a certain point in the book, you make this very bold assertion that it is my belief that those who have experienced mental illness are actually primed for awakening, which is one of the most radical and interesting messages of this wonderful book. Would you like to tell us a bit how you got to this point?
Um, I guess that I had two parallel journeys, really. One was my professional journey, in which I was working in acute mental health and in an inpatient ward, particularly in a secure ward, so where people had been quite severely psychotic and ended up in hospital often after some risky things happening before they came into hospital. Um,
Right.
And so I was looking after people in those situations. And at the same time, I was embarking on my own spiritual journey in terms of meditation and mindfulness, um, and kind of having experiences through that. And I started to see parallels between the two things. So on the one hand, people who had had mental health difficulties uh, had a kind of there were certain things happening in terms of their ability to be sometimes very present with what was happening before them, um, uh,
Yes.
sensitive to what's going on in their environment, also sometimes oscillating between being filled with lots of thoughts, but also often sometimes also having times when they're sort of devoid of thought, where there's a lack of thought inside and they're
Yeah.
on some kind of void. And on the other hand, I was also going through those experiences through my own voluntary mindfulness practice, watching my mind whirl away, in the way that people would say that, people with mental health difficulties are experiencing. Sometimes they're watching my mind get quite still. And so I would see the parallels between the two and think maybe something similar is happening with both of us. Um, and it was that gave me the idea that perhaps actually at the same time as breaking down, there's also something that's breaking through, because fundamentally,
Yeah.
a very large majority of people who've had severe mental health experiences um, also describe themselves as very spiritual. They also say that
Yes.
spirituality is a very important part of their life. Far higher percentage than in the general public. Something like 80 something percent of people who've had severe mental health problems describe themselves as highly spiritual, compared probably to only a tenth of that in the general public. So there's something happening in that experience that connects you up to something bigger, and you can't necessarily define it. You can't pin it down in terms of a particular religious doctrine, but it's a very it's some kind of experience they're having beyond the normal kind of material world that we live in. And I also find that people who are meditating and also doing these things longer term also have similar experiences. So there's something happening, and I kind of try to understand it in terms of a breakdown of ego. So those of us who
Yeah.
are going through a bit of spiritual practice are deliberately dismantling our ego, but other people who may have had traumatic experiences in their lives, and most of the
Yeah.
patients who I worked with had those traumatic experiences, have had their ego broken down by the outside world, and as a result, some of this wisdom and knowing is also flooding in. But it can be very frightening because it's not happening at a gradual pace. It's not happening under their control. So it's a collapse as well as an opening up at the same time. So that's kind of how I started to understand by looking at my own subjective experience and those of the people I was working with at the same time.
The idea that a mental health breakdown may have a deep positive twist to it. It's a rather radical message for a psychiatrist working for the NHS in the UK to be saying out
It is a
loud. How are your colleagues reacting to it?
well, it is a different perspective, and I guess that first of all, the most important reactions are from people who had mental health difficulties.
Yeah,
That's what I'm for, and there's been very, very positive reactions. I mean, every couple of weeks I get somebody contacting me, often through social media, saying that they're really grateful because it totally resonated with their experience, and having a professional say that really helps validate their own sense of what it was.
right.
So that's who I wrote it for, and I'm really glad it's having that impact all the time. In terms of other colleagues, there's actually a lot of openness because I'm not contradicting necessarily a lot of the things that they're thinking too. It's like there are different ways of looking at things. This is looking at it from another perspective and kind of layer underneath that perhaps underneath this there's something else happening. And to be honest with you, I think that all but a relative minority of psychiatrists would deny that there is something that they don't really know about their field, that they don't understand.
Right.
So when
Yeah.
we're not like, for example, physical health doctors, like a chest doctor, so like a respiratory physician
Yes.
who can look at an X-ray of a lung and tell you what disease that person has. We don't have any such test in mental health.
Yeah.
You know we don't. So there's
Yeah.
no thing you can say to someone who comes to you and say, right, now have this blood test or this investigation, and I'll tell you whether or not your diagnosis is X. That does not exist anywhere in mental health. And so we all know that we're dealing with something that is not fully known and understood. And it's only the most arrogant, really, who will turn around and say, oh, that's rubbish, we know everything about our field and we're not open to any other ways of understanding it. So as a result, I haven't really had negative reactions. Anybody who's at all interested in reading the book will have been curious to start with. And when I've presented it to colleagues, people have a general openness to it. And I suppose the thing that I'm advocating in terms of helping people is not so much abandoning working in mental health or anything, or abandoning having a mental health system. It's more about creating a mental health system that's open so that we can all learn from each other's experiences more democratically and kind of sit with each other's journeys rather than trying to remove them. And sometimes there will be occasions where we might need medication and hospitalization because things have become too severe and unmanageable. But other times, actually, our duty is to sit with them, a bit like a midwife kind of sitting through a birth process. So it adds something to our job and it adds a richness to it. And it doesn't deny some of the existing tools that we sometimes use, but it puts that in more of a context.
Yeah. No, that's very, very interesting. And it sort of connects with an older literature. And you mentioned some of these people like Stan Grof, who has worked on the idea of spiritual emergencies, for instance.
Mm.
At a certain point, you also have a really interesting chapter called Ego Inflammation, which I suppose is where your mental health background combines together with your experience in Buddhist meditation. Can you tell us a bit about what you mean by this ego inflammation?
Yeah, I guess that what I was kind of observing is that I suppose from my very earliest days in working in mental health, a common strand that I'd found in the people I was working with is that there's lots of thinking going on. You know, people who are having mental health difficulties, their thinking mind is really active. You know, whether it's in a positive way, taking them high, or a negative way, taking them low, or all sorts of creative thoughts. You know, in psychosis, there's lots and lots of thinking going on. And as I studied and experienced more Buddhist teachings, I understood that our thinking mind is something that is only a part of our intelligence. You know, we have a deeper intelligence in our body that we can link to. But this sense of self is really the ultimate construct of our thinking mind, this sense of being an individual person, of being a me. The truth is that there is no consistent me in any of us. You know, as we grow older, we change shape. Every single organ of our body is changing. Every part of us is changing every few years. Physically, we're not the same person we were just this morning because so much oxygen and carbon has entered and exited our body the whole time. We're a constant piece of flux. You know, we're not really one specific whole static, constant thing. And so And this idea of being an ego, of being an individual, is something that is a product of our thinking mind. And so sometimes in all of us, not just people having mental health difficulties, everybody will go through times when our thinking mind really kind of starts to whirl in a big way. Our sense of self gets really embroiled in thoughts, in in sort of things that have happened in our lives, in parts of our stories, and we get caught up in this whirlwind of thinking and relating ourselves to things, and our ego, our sense of self, starts to inflate, and that doesn't necessarily mean becoming arrogant, although that could be one of the things, but it means just having a really kind of, your mind is just really whirring, and what are people thinking about me, or having thoughts about other people. So a whole sense of thought processes can really trigger off, and it all, one way or another, will relate to the concept of self. And so this is a kind of ego inflammation that can happen, and it can lead to lots of different permutations, which we then end up describing as mental health diagnoses. But when that inflammation happens, just like any inflammation, so if you have an inflammation of the skin after it's been damaged, it will start to inflame. But any inflammation also results in cracks occurring. So in the same way as our ego, our sense of self, starts to inflame, it's also therefore more likely to start to crack in places. And those cracks, I believe, are the kind of sense of beyondness, the sense of being more than just me, that also creeps in. So even despite the turmoil that people might experience in mental health difficulties, or even just stress in their lives, at exactly those times is when this sense of being more than just me, this sense of being connected with everything in some way, starts to pour in at the same time. So at exactly that traumatic time, exactly that sort of difficult time, we also start experiencing this greaterness than other. And that's why I think that whether anything from stress all the way to psychosis, these are times when we're also more likely to get another sense of who we really are, which is more than this sort of thought and language defined self.
So when we talk about the ego or the self, we tend to think of it in a unitary way. It's as if I am only a single self or a single individual, and I have a very predefined sense of identity. But actually, I mean, that's not what happens. And if you start paying attention, and especially if you use some spiritual technique like meditation, you start getting in touch with other parts of yourself which you may not be aware. So is it just the sense of one self or various selves which may or may not come together?
Sorry, what was the last bit? Is it just a sense of?
Yeah, if it's just one ego or one self being inflamed, or it's also lack of awareness and acknowledgement of different structures of our psyche which we not be aware of.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that we are raised up from being children into the world of language, and the world of language, by definition, requires us to differentiate ourselves from the world around us.
Yeah.
You can't say a sentence without it involving elements of it, key elements of it, that make you different to the surroundings you're in. But you see, children, newborn babies don't have this. They don't have this sense of being different to the wall on the other side of the room, or the floor beneath them, or the ceiling above them. They don't have that. And it's actually only as they develop language that they start to develop that over time. This differentiation starts to occur, me and you, here and there, here and now, all these different constructs that we put in place. And they seem to be reality, and all these things to us. We think that we are something else from the surroundings that we have among us. But I mean, and we look at the world that way. So if we look at a tree in the middle of a field, we think there's the field and there's the tree. But the truth is that the tree couldn't exist without the field. The tree is deeply embedded in the field. Their roots directly into the field. The field and the tree are actually one thing, one organism, but we are designed to think of the tree as separate to the field. In the same way that we couldn't exist without the universe around us, and the two things are entirely inseparable. And just because we may not be conscious of those things of us that are outside us, in the same way that we're conscious of some of our thoughts, doesn't mean that we're any less those things. So we're usually not conscious of, for example, our bowels moving. They're moving all the time. If you put a stethoscope to your stomach, you'll hear your bowels moving, but you're not conscious of that. but that doesn't mean that those bowels aren't yours. Similarly, you might not be conscious of the clouds moving in the sky, but that just because you're not conscious of it doesn't mean that that's also not part of you. Now, this will sound crazy to the way that we normally think about things, because we normally think of ourselves as separate to the sky, But in reality, you don't have to muck around with science too much before it becomes evident that that's obviously the case. I mean, there are many physicists who talk on exactly these terms and say that the sense of life being discrete entities doesn't make any sense in terms of actual modern science. David Bohm was a brilliant Nobel-winning physicist, and he talked about how when there's a carbon dioxide atom, a couple of atoms of carbon dioxide, a molecule of carbon dioxide, cease becoming inert and inorganic matter and become, as we breathe it in, or say an oxygen molecule, become, as we breathe it in, a part of living life, i.e. a part of me. And then when we breathe out the carbon dioxide with the oxygen in it again, when does it cease being part of me, part of life, and then becomes part of non-life air? So these are arbitrary distinctions that we're making all the time. So the idea that we are a separate self, an enclosed entity, is an idea that we have created.
Yes.
And it neglects so much of what we really are. And as you say, through engaging in some experiences, we start to see all those layers that we've built that make us see the world that way.
And the idea that we're separate from others and our environment is particularly prevalent in the modern West. Yeah. And this surely has some kind of influence also on mental health, probably by reinforcing the sense of isolated and atomized ego. We're much more likely, to stumble upon mental health problems. This reminds me, for instance, that the prognosis or the recovery rate for psychosis in India is much better than in the UK. And I was once talking to a psychiatrist who worked in both contexts, saying that one major difference is not just the social network, but the sort of spectrum of consciousness and behavior which is accepted is much wider in India than here. So here you have a much smaller frame of what is considered a normal, working, functional behavior. Does that resonate with your...
Yes, absolutely. And it's wider than just India. I mean, the statistics are very clear. The WHO have done studies all the way back from the mid-60s up to 2000 plus. So they've done about 50 years of studies. And in these studies, they've looked at outcomes for people with psychosis in developing countries. So not just India, but Nigeria, parts of Africa, compared to developed countries. And they found that if you live in a developing country, you're more likely to have a better long-term outcome than if you live in the developed West. And why is that? And that's a big head scratcher for people who work in the mental health field in the West. Why is it that if you lived in a developing country where they hardly have any mental health services, people have better long-term outcomes? And I think that there are two things, as you say, really. One is social networks. I mean, people do have a wider, more extended social networks, and so there's more of a community that they could sit with through their experience. But the other is an openness to all sorts of understandings of the experience. So rather than it being, okay, you have a disease, and that's wrong, and you need to be thinking right, rather than it being classified to them in those binary terms, there's a community of validation around them saying, if you do believe that you are something else, or you're connected to something else, or you're feeling all these connections and all these things happening, maybe there's something in that. Maybe that we can understand that from a different context. Maybe that does make a bit of sense to us, in general terms. So you don't have to feel stigmatized by having these thoughts. It's not necessarily defined as crazy. Where it might result in some difficulties in living, then of course the family will try and rally around and help with that. But within that is potentially this couch of understanding in terms of, there's more of an acceptance in less westernized cultures, let's say, so not just India, but just generally, of seeing the world quite differently, of not necessarily just feeling that we are apart from the world, that we're all kind of discrete entities. And I think that philosophical difference, as well as that kind of difference in community ethos, is probably one of the biggest reasons why the outcomes are very unexpectedly consistently found to be better in those parts of the world.
Yeah, this reminds me that James Hillman, who studied with Jung and wrote towards the end of his life, a book of interviews which was called 100 Years of Psychotherapy and the World Isn't Getting Any Better. He was saying that psychotherapy has probably caused a certain wrong idea about our psyche only being within the individual and not also outside of us in the social world, but also in the environment. And we have become so separate from the environment and the social world that suddenly the environment starts becoming toxic. So there's all sorts of things around the world, which, whether it's environmental change or whether it's toxins around us. So it's as if we have become secular and separate from the world. But in virtue of this, the world around us starts becoming threatening in a way that it wasn't before when we lived in a closer connection to the world.
Yes, yeah, and I think that we do live in a very individualized society, and it's becoming more and more individualized. And I've got a young daughter who's just 5 months old, and I worry about what we're feeding her, but at the same time, we can't not do those things, because we live in the modern world. So there's TV and there's internet and there's fast food around us, all these things, and one day she'll graduate her way into all those things, but the nature of them is such that it kind of hyper-atomizes us. So people were worried about an atomized society in the West shortly after the Second World War. And that was 70 years ago, before the internet, before all these things. And what's happened as a result is that, you'll go into a kind of public area where many people might be seated in close proximity to each other, and nobody's looking at each other or having any contact with each other, and all looking into their phones. And so we are becoming more and more atomized. At the same time, though, I think it's also important to recognize that there are connections also forming within this. So the internet, for example, is also why. We are connecting through the internet. If there was no internet, we probably wouldn't have been having this interview. So there's also connections forming within that. So a friend of mine once said that everything is going wrong and everything is going right at the same time. And I think there's something like that happening. So on the one hand, we are becoming more and more atomized, and we are becoming more and more discrete and separate, But on the other hand, I also do think that yearning for connection is still there, and we're finding it. And for example, if you look at our political system at the moment, it does look like it's falling apart, which is not a bad thing. We're having people go to the fringes because they're just sick of a mainstream moderate consensus. They want to strike out. And I think ultimately, the only way any form of political system will eventually be able to work is not by having politicians who are elected to serve terms, but having people decide on policies themselves through mass plebiscites and things like this, by using the technology we have. Because people are very passionate about issues. So you have some people who are immensely passionate about the environment. You have other people who are immensely passionate about wealth distribution and things like this. And they should be able to take charge and take power into their hands, not as an office holder, but as somebody who is able to influence the public and start to have some say in policy that way. So I think that there's strong currents of energy running through us. I think that this kind of general shift towards a more atomized society is at the same time creating a kind of backlash, which is also seeping itself through a number of channels. Because ultimately, we kind of carnate to relate. I think we exist in order to relate to each other, and I think that can never be killed off. However many ways we are trying. I don't really believe in conspiracies out there in terms of great elites trying to, block it. We're doing it. I'm doing it as much as you're doing it. Everyone's doing it. But at the same time, we're also trying to overcome that. So it's a fascinating, dynamic movement in multiple directions.
I deeply sympathize with what you're saying, and part of the feeling I get is that the current interest in meditation and mindfulness has to do with that deep sense of unwellness and dissatisfaction. People are looking for other ways of connecting, not just to other people, but even to themselves. Is that also your understanding? And particularly, I suppose, also within the mental health sector.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that as a society, we have become increasingly kind of moved in this direction towards our heads. So our thinking mind, the dominance of our heads, is basically where we have travelled as a society in recent years. And there was a comedian called Emo Phillips who put it well when he said, I used to think that the brain was the most important organ in my body, and then I realized who was telling me that. And I think that's exactly the way it is in terms of, we have been moving in a direction that makes us think that our brains have all the answers and we need to be brain-led, But actually, I think that what mindfulness and other practices like this have been doing is bringing us into our bodies. And we have a whole different wisdom in our bodies that animals have, for example. Other species have more than we do in terms of connecting to a deeper aspect of who we are. And that doesn't have the same logical, constructive answers that our minds have. But actually, we need to sort of reintroduce that balance. So we're more in touch with what's happening here. And exercises like mindfulness and things like this are very powerfully able to do that, because it's almost like sitting in your body and watching your mind. So you're bringing your awareness centralized into the body. And you're not stopping the mind, so the body isn't interested in stopping the mind. You're allowing the mind to flow, you're observing it, but you're not identifying it with it in the same way that you would otherwise have done. So, yeah, I think that all of those things are moving us in a positive direction, and it's all about kind of recalibrating and centering ourselves back into our bodies, which is, I think, essential now for us as a species.
But at the same time, isn't there the danger that by stripping the spiritual component out of meditation and mindfulness, we may either make it just like any other commodified good, something you just use and stop using? And can't it also be used by corporations to kind of as sort of palliative to make their employees a little bit happier so that they don't complain against the management?
Yeah, I mean, I have heard this criticism and concern, and I understand it. I mean, I guess I see it this way, that John Kabat-Zinn and lots of the guys who brought mindfulness into the mainstream, these were the academics who really got mindfulness out there and brought it into mental health, and then from there it's come out to wider society. If they didn't bring the spiritual component out of it, it would never have got to where it got. It would never have got the acceptance that it had. And I could never really, I'm building on their work by writing my book, So I think that they've done what they needed to do at that time. And as with any action, there's always an equal and opposite reaction. So unfortunately, the downside to what they did as well is the fact that people have tried to sanitize mindfulness and see it only, as you described, as a very kind of discreet, almost treatment type of thing that you can give to people to take away. But the truth is that mindfulness has come from a spiritual practice. Not just Buddhism, but every religion has an esoteric division that practices something like mindfulness, absolutely every single one. So it's not a sectarian form of religious practice, but it comes from the spiritual realm. And there are therefore spiritual aspects to it. And if you practice for long enough, then you will start to have those connections with your body and through your body to a deeper sense of self, a broader sense of self beyond just the ego. And unfortunately, because it has been sold into the health system anyway as a purely clinical thing, because of that, those things are now being experienced of or thought of as side effects. That actually, when people are having these experiences, there must be side effects of mindfulness. It's not what should happen, and so you need to be careful. But the thing is, mindfulness was invented for those reasons. Those are the experiences that mindfulness was designed to create. So this is why we need to be honest about the spiritual dimensions to it. And when I teach mindfulness to people, I teach mindfulness mainly to clinicians. I believe that actually we can probably do most good by clinicians learning mindfulness. And through learning mindfulness and sitting with their own distress, they can help other people travel with theirs, rather than going ahead and teaching people directly, because often in high states of distress, you're not able to do it at that moment. So when I teach clinicians mindfulness, I am very open with them about the fact that it comes from a spiritual place. There are very many spiritual aspects to it. If you want to learn it, then I'll teach you about that too. And then I tend to do that in my retreats. And almost everybody comes for that bit as well, to learn about the spiritual aspects of mindfulness and how actually you can feel a deeper sense of self through these practices. And that's not a bad thing. You shouldn't be scared of it. You should be prepared for it, because that's what it's there for. So I think we're now, because of that, the way that it was brought in the first place, I think we're now at a stage where there are enough people who are interested in learning the wider aspects of it. And I think that's going on increasingly. So I'm actually spending this afternoon at the Royal College of Psychiatrists I'm part of a executive of a group called the Spirituality Special Interest Group, and there we do often have exactly this conversation about mindfulness and whether or not it's been sort of stripped of its spiritual core. And we run workshops there for psychiatrists. And at those workshops, we do talk about the spiritual dimensions of mindfulness, and we have hundreds of psychiatrists coming to these workshops to learn about this. So I think that now we're at a stage where we can start to broaden out that understanding, because it's needed. Otherwise, people will start to get a bit perturbed by what's going on after they start practicing this way for a while.
Well, that's very, very good to hear. That's very, very interesting to know that there is that kind of opening. So getting into the more nuanced part of this, meditation can lead to very different experiences. So you have someone who starts doing it for 20 minutes, and after a few months he starts having an unusual experience. It can be, for instance, an out-of-body experience. Other people, however, claim that something else is happening. They get in touch, for instance, with a memory of a childhood trauma. And this leads them then into a different direction. And there is an ongoing discussion, I mean, even within the psychiatric and mental health literature, about what is a mental health breakdown and what would constitute a spiritual experience, or what would differentiate a true spiritual emergency from a mental health condition. So from your perspective, I'm not sure if there is a difference, but I just like to ask.
Yeah. Well, I think you answered it at the end there. I really don't think that there's a difference, because in order to believe that they're separate things, we have to think in very linear terms. So the way that Stan Grof originally pronounced this, and I know that right now as we speak, there's a conversation going on with the Grof Foundation and in the Spiritual Emergence Network around this philosophical question, and whether or not they should adhere to the original description. And the intelligence I have from inside that is very much that is there's a very strong feeling that should be abandoned. That original kind of dichotomous description should probably be abandoned, and I think very few people hold to it anymore. But the original description was that on the one hand, you have people who are expanding their consciousness through spiritual experiences and therefore having a spiritual emergency. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have people whose consciousness is contracting and therefore they are having a psychotic episode. So the danger is if you mistake one for the other. And so it's very dichotomous. These guys are being liberated through their spiritual, and these guys are being imprisoned and having a very different experience, and we shouldn't think that they're the same as them. But the reality is that it's not a linear line like this. It's actually a circle. The two things very much come together. So if you have you're having a spiritual experience through your own practices, for example, you're also vulnerable to some instability at that point. And that's really true.
Yeah.
And at the same time, if you've had some instability through trauma and stress and difficult times in your life, you're also vulnerable to start to experience these exact same spiritual experiences that you're having at the same time. So it's very, very mixed. It's not a linear picture. Hardly anybody who has come at it from the traumatic background and had major trauma has very, very many of them, the vast majority have also had spiritual experiences embedded within that. But also hardly anybody who has had major spiritual openings through spiritual practice hasn't also felt some form of instability attached with that. It also rocks your world. It also creates some kind of real sense of disorientation.
Yeah, and you give a wonderful example in the book of your own experience. So after having a very blissful experience, this led to all sorts of emotional turmoil going on.
Yeah. So I'd been meditating for several years, and then I had a couple of meditations in which it just felt like a total, I don't know, like the whole world had sort of shifted, and I just sort of felt it as if it was something I was wearing rather than something that was actually there when I wasn't looking all the time. There was a very different relationship I felt to things, and I was lucky that at that time there was a couple of people who were very open to mindfulness as a route to having these experiences. Not saying, oh well, you should, and had those experiences themselves and knew about them. One was a Zen master who'd been practicing and teaching meditation for a couple of decades, and another was a chaplain in my trust who was very experienced at meditation and had experiences like this herself. And they talk me through it, and it's very much, yeah, this is kind of what happens, and this is a good thing because it is opening your eyes to different perspectives on the world, and actually how me in the professional position I'm in could help others by showing how this is actually not a bad experience to have. It does, yes, there are other ways of understanding the world, as we were talking about at the beginning, in terms of not necessarily just seeing yourself as that encapsulated ego individual self. And so it kind of broke through this shell. I had this experience of breaking through this shell. And ever since then, I've kind of felt myself existing on different levels, on a kind of individual ego level, but at the same time, not existing at that level at all. It goes from being something that was extraordinary to something that you kind of walk around with feeling a lot of the time. It doesn't stop you from being human and interacting and having a lunch and and getting on the bus and all those things. So I was lucky because I had guidance, and also I was able to maintain being grounded through it. But it did teach me, as you say, the fact that there's something in the great distress that the patients I was working with were experiencing that was also real and important to them. And even if it still meant that a lot of the treatment they were having still needed to be had in order to avoid them having too much distress and having all of the other difficulties that come with it, despite that, it also meant that we could say that actually there might be something positive in what you're having too. If you are saying that this has also opened your eyes and also given you something positive, then I can relate to that too. Then perhaps you are. And I suppose what it's helped me with most is that by having some kind of disorientating experiences through my mindfulness that I managed to integrate into an understanding of what the world is like more, I have been able to connect to my patients through a subjective route rather than just through reading textbooks and understanding their symptoms. It's more about actually, what I can kind of touch some of what you've been through. And that's why I think mindfulness for clinicians is so important. I think the only real way that you can help people is by traveling that distance inside yourself, by then being able to touch some of what they're experiencing. And that, I think, is the best form of education in mental health.
In the way that it brings about a deeper sense of empathy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so rather than going for a cost effectiveness paradigm, which is making us all just very heartless and cold.
Yeah, or a kind of checklist paradigm where we're
Yes.
trying to understand people through a sort of series of tick boxes.
Yeah. No, I can see that. Okay, so that was a really, really, interesting and revealing experience. But you were very fortunate in the way that you had people who knew what you were going through and had gone through this experience themselves. I suspect that most people, even teaching mindfulness courses, may not know how to deal with that kind of experience. But then again, there was something else which you go on to describe in your book, how you had a robust sense of yourself, and how, of course, even though you can have the experience that ultimately there is no real separation between you and the world and another individual, still you are Russell, you are within your body, and the other person is. There is a little anecdote that one of your teachers says that if you want to eat my food, then there is a problem because there is no clear sense of a healthy boundary.
Yeah.
Right. So there is something curious in the way that you need to have a healthy sense of yourself before you can transcend it. So I'm not sure if you're aware of the distinction between a pre-personal and a transpersonal experience. It has come out about in the transpersonal literature, but I think it was Jung who originally thought of it. The idea that, for instance, a child or when you're in your mother's womb, you don't really have a separation between yourself and your mother. So you have potentially this oceanic state of being where there is no separation. However, this is different from your mystical experience, your transpersonal experience of going beyond yourself as a healthy adult. Does this sort of resonate with you?
Yeah, you mean in terms of already having those experiences from your youngest years, and it's something that you connected, you are already aware of because you've had them.
Yeah, you can, but at the same time, so you need to build up a healthy sense of self or ego before you can deconstruct it.
Yes. Absolutely, and I think that that is why, for example, mindfulness practice isn't necessarily something to rush into. And for people who've had mental health difficulties, you need to take it at your own pace. And so it can never be prescribed. You can never say mindfulness is the solution to people's mental health difficulties. That's what they need, in order to get better. That's not the case. Because, as you say, if you're not ready for it, then it's not right for you at that time. And people will self-screen, so it's generally safe for that reason. I mean, I know people and friends who've had mindfulness practice for decades, but then they've been hit by a bereavement and they've stopped. And that was right, because it was probably too hard for them at that time. So I think that, yes, you do need to be in a grounded place to be able to benefit from it and to be able to do it. This sense of self that you have, this sense of being separate, is also very important in and of itself. So I think that's right. You do need to develop that. And that's also why I think people who are having these experiences without that being there, it can be quite a difficult and troubling experience. But at the same time, I think it's important to be able to say to people who are having that experience, there was something really profound in the fact that you had that. There was something really important in that experience. But perhaps the help that you need now is around trying to ground right now. So whether it's going into nature, whether it's actually helping you sleep, or even having medication right now, or coming away from your normal environment. There's a series of things, many of which will involve traditional treatments to help people ground themselves into that sense of self, into this kind of material realm. And that can be very important first stage in treatment, actually, which is paradoxical. It's not, okay, in order to really grasp the spiritual that you have started to open up to, we'll go further down that route. Actually, the thing to do right now, perhaps, while you're disorientated and don't have this sense of you being you anymore, is to get that back first. It's important to be able to hold on to that while you're having these experiences, because otherwise, as you say in that anecdote I gave, it can be a problem. I mean, the Buddhist teacher put it to me very well. He was a monk of many years, and said that at one level we are all one. At one level, you and I are indeed one. But if I try and feed you my breakfast, then we have a problem. So it's exactly that. If you're not able to function at this level of separation at the same time, then it becomes a problematic thing. So yeah, it's very much about helping people with being able to find a place in both, and so that will involve different things for different people. But making sure that we can be grounded is really important.
Yeah. Now, we've been talking about meditation therapy. A question which I always like to ask therapists is, to what an extent a meditation practice can be a replacement for a good, solid relationship with a therapist, in the sense that that kind of therapeutical bond can lead to a change in early emotional patterns. And it's hard for me to envisage how meditation would be able to change kind of early attachment patterns in the way that a healthy relationship with a therapist would.
So are you saying that you mean people's early attachments and things like that, and whether or not meditation can have a...
Yeah, so for instance, within psychodynamic therapy, but also, I think you also mentioned this, you cite this in your book, that one of the most robust findings of over 50, 60 years of therapy is that what predicts the best outcomes is the relationship you have, the therapeutic bond you have.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, to what an extent meditation can or cannot mimic that deep bond which is formed between two people within a therapeutic context.
Can or cannot limit the bond.
Can or cannot mimic. To what an extent it can, for instance, lead to a more secure sense of emotional attachment.
I think that the most important therapeutic thing, the most important thing in mental health treatment, is the bond that exists, and that's the healing thing. The bond that exists between the clinicians and the client and the network that they're working with. I think that bond is the most important ingredient to healing. And there's lots of studies that show this, and it's ignored, and people think it's other things, but that's the most important thing. And
so more important than the technique itself.
More important than the technique, but there are some techniques that actually focus on that don't pretend to have any other elements, that it's all about that. Like open dialogue, for example, is about arranging the whole mental health system around that kind of bond, around having a good network a good relationship between the clinicians and the people involved, and also family members coming together to form a democratic and also a very close bonded team together, working together as partners. And that, creating that relationship, and it becomes a relationship of love. I'm working that way now with people, and it's a wonderful way to work. And you create that bond, and that's the most important therapeutic thing. That's absolutely fundamental. So you work together, and you work through this evolving relationship together.
But that's very difficult. You bring the family together.
Yeah, I mean, I'm now engaged in a large NHS study where we have 6 trusts across the country which have allocated a team to work this way. Open Dialogue started in Finland, and we have got those guys to train us here in the UK, and we have a number of teams in the country that are starting to work this way, and we're going to evaluate the outcomes for our patients over a few years compared to the usual treatment. And it is all about a few clinicians coming together, a couple of clinicians coming together with the patient and their family and forming a really close network, and we can meet sometimes for hours together, and we can meet very frequently, but then we will always stay with each other throughout the whole of the treatment process. It may be months, it may be years, we will always stay together. And it's that bond that creates the transformative change. And we have seen that already, just within a year of starting this. We have seen many people who have been in the system for 20, 30 years say, right, I feel myself better than I've ever done in my life. This is a complete change in my life because of those bonds that we've created. So the bond is key. And the fact that that bond is key is not necessarily related to mindfulness practice. So it may involve some people being taught mindfulness. It might not at all. Most of the cases that we're working with, it doesn't involve those things. Unless somebody asks and they think that mindfulness is important to them, that's fine. It doesn't necessarily, for me, either impede or improve that relationship. It's in different people. If people feel called, and I always stress this, mindfulness practice must be volunteered for. It must be something that the person wants to bring themselves to, in which case, okay, you can help them to do that. There's many ways to do that these days. There's online and offline resources, etc. So mindfulness practice can be part of any treatment system, that's fine. But you shouldn't really advocate it unless you're doing it yourself. You wouldn't learn to drive a car from someone who can't drive a car. And secondly, it has to be purely volunteered by that person if they want to do it. And if they do, then that's fine. But it won't take away from the relationship if they're not using it instead of that bond that you're creating. And it won't necessarily add to it either. It is what it is. It's something that people can do on top of whatever else they're doing. They can do it briefly every day. I tend to recommend daily practice, and it's hard to sustain. And we all come on and off at different times. But so I don't see it necessarily as a hindrance or a help necessarily to the therapeutic relationship, or even a necessity. I don't think that it's necessary for healing. It can be a good thing if you're at the right stage in your life. Maybe you've finished with the mental health system, you've had a really good experience, you've had this kind of therapy, you've come out of it, and that was 5-10 years ago, and now you're ready to start a meditation or a yoga practice that can help you connect in this way to yourself more deeply. That's perfect for you too. That might be the perfect timing. Now you're ready later on. So it'll be different for different people, and I don't think one is required for the other or one inhibits the other or anything like that.
So if you're carrying now this kind of, interesting systemic family work, there is hope for mental health services within the NHS.
Well, that's what I'm working really hard. I have to say, Miguel, I'm working literally flat out to try to achieve that. I mean, I kind of I'm putting a huge amount of energy into this, and I have managed to get we've got about £1 million of investment into the project so far from across the country, with people training, altogether about 120, 30 staff from across the country in different teams who are trained in working this way. The staff are extremely excited about working in this very different way with their patients, forming these wonderful bonds with them. And I've also collected a team of very high-level academics, including from NICE, who have also been inspired by this way of working and are putting together an application for a £2.3 million grant to evaluate this way of working over the next 5 to 6 years. If we get the grant, we're at stage 2 of the application. We've actually got through the first stage, so that's positive, but there's still a big road to go. If we get the grant, then we'll be evaluating this open dialogue peer-supported open dialogue, because we have people with lived experience working with us too. So if we get the grant, then we'll be evaluating our new way of working over the next 4 or 5 years, and the aim is to show then it would be an argument for complete NHS-wide system change. And some of the professors involved in helping us with the academic evaluation were involved in setting up the current system, and they're really looking to create some change too. So I don't know if it will work, but my dedication of my energy these days is very much to try to get that research out there. And if it really proves it, then it will be hard for anyone to say that they were against a form of care that produces better outcomes by far. And in the long run, costs less, because if you can help people liberate themselves from the psychiatric system and live independent lives through initially having this kind of care for just a couple of years rather than 20 or 30 or 50 years, then it will cost less money as well. So it will be better, it will be a win-win. So I'm hoping to prove this over the next few years. I don't know if I can, but it has been building in an amazing way in recent times. It's the crisis in mental health care that has enabled us to do something radical like this. And if it works, then then hopefully we'll see a very different kind of mental health system in a number of years from now. But we'll see.
I'm really, really happy and impressed. It is indeed a radical but a wholesome possibility. That's really, really wonderful. Thank you so much, Russell. I've been speaking to Dr. Russell Razzaque, who's written Breaking Down is Waking Up, an insightful and book that challenges many of our conceptions about mental health, breakdown, and spirituality. Thank you so much.
Thank you.